Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters. I hope everyone is doing well, inshallah. Another one of the highlights in the life of our beloved Prophet and his seerah is the way he went about community building. When the Prophet, of course, came to Medina, there was a major shift in the way he was going to do things now, because while the Prophet was in Mecca, the main goal of the Muslims was simply to survive. If you made it through the whole day, from the morning to nighttime, and you were still alive as a Muslim in Mecca, you were still protected as a Muslim in Mecca. If you went through even one day like that, that would be a very important goal that was achieved. That would be a big deal. When the Prophet came to Medina, things, of course, became very different. It was no longer a matter of survival. It was no longer a matter of let's get through the day without getting persecuted and tortured and so on and so forth. Now the Prophet took on a completely different perspective, a different approach. That approach was, not only do we have to survive, that's of course a given the welcoming atmosphere of Medina, but now we have to grow. Now we have to build what we would refer to as community. So how did the Prophet go about this? There's many lessons to learn from this. The Prophet, of course, began to invest in the community. And one of the biggest ways that the Prophet invested in the community is that the first step that he took was building a masjid. In fact, if you look through history, you find the Prophet didn't build just one masjid. In fact, he built two masjids. Yes? Because first, there was, of course, Masjid al-Quba, and then later on, Masjid al-Nabi as well. But Masjid al-Quba is technically before the Prophet has even entered fully into Medina, before he has been fully established in Medina. And some historians and historical narrations will tell us that before the Prophet has even found a place for himself to live, he is now planning to build Masjid al-Quba. At that time, he was living with some of the other companions. Now, why is Masjid al-Quba so critical, so important? What lesson does that teach us? It teaches us two lessons. First of all, that the first thing the Prophet was thinking about when he came to Medina was, how do I build a structure, a framework, a community where the believers can come together, they can socialize, they can connect with one another, they can turn into one body. This is very important. Before the Prophet came and taught many of the other rules as it related to Islam, because many of the rules that were revealed in Medina would be coming afterwards. Before he even did that, one of the most important things he did was building community. This is number one. Number two, the way he built community was by building a masjid. Now, in today's world, especially within our communities in the Western world, so to speak, a masjid's role, unfortunately, has come down simply to being a place where someone prays, or someone, for example, holds a majlis. It has essentially become a place that is simply a place of worship. When we look during the time of the Prophet, that was not the case. The masjid was the center of pretty much all affairs of life. So if someone had needed help and they were dealing with the situation, the masjid is where they would go. If someone wanted to get married, that masjid is one of the places that they would stop, at least. If someone wanted to learn, they were looking for knowledge, the masjid is one of the places that they would go. If someone wanted to attend Jum'ah and wanted to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not just by themselves, but in congregation, the masjid is where they would go. When there was an announcement that needed to be made and everyone needed to be informed of it, the masjid is where you would go. Many times when they wanted to gather to move to another location, move outside of Medina, the masjid was where they used to gather. All of these different functions, and there are many more as well, shows us that the masjid played a far bigger role. And so one of the lessons we have to learn from the life of the Prophet is that the masjid needs to come out of this framework of just being a place of worship. Yes, it's a place of worship, there's no doubt about that. That's one of the most important functions of a masjid, and a role that no other place can replace. No other place can play this role. But there were also a lot of other elements as well. And so you find, for example, the Prophet, when he woke up for Fajr and he prayed Fajr in the masjid, after Fajr, one of his habits was that he would sit and people would come and sit around him, and they would share the issues that they are dealing with. Some scholars have said this was part of the ta'qibat that the Prophet used to do in the morning after Fajr, and many other social interactions that were taking place in or around the masjid. So you find the Prophet gave a lot of importance to this. If he came and he built a masjid, Masjid al-Quba, as the first masjid built in Islam, and later on Masjid al-Nabi, it wasn't just because he wanted to build a place of worship, but because he knew this would be the foundation and the framework behind building one ummah and building one community. That is what our masajid need to move towards, inshallah. This is why we read in history, the Prophet, he worked so closely with the Muhajirin and the Ansar. And by the way, these were different groups. How do you approach each one of them? This is beautiful leadership by the Holy Prophet. So the narrations say that as they were building Masjid al-Quba, and everyone was picking up these heavy bricks to put them and to organize them and to position them, they say the Prophet also was taking part in all of this work. And the narration says, we remember seeing the whiteness of the bricks from the dust, from the dirt on his beard while he was working. And some of us would approach him and say, Ya Rasulullah, we can help you. You don't need to work. To which the Prophet would respond, if you have extra time, you want to help me, go and grab an extra brick so that we can move faster in building the masjid. And the narrations beautifully tell us that as the Prophet was working on this community building project, you find that he built this harmony amongst the Muhajirin and Ansar. And they had poetry that they used to say. So they used to recite, لَعِنْ قَعَدْنَا وَالنَّبِيُّ يَعْمَلُ لَذَلِكَ مِنَّا الْعَمَلُ الْمُضِلُّ. If we sit while the Prophet is working, this is certainly not the type of thing that we should be doing. La Aisha, they used to respond, the Prophet used to respond to them. La Aisha illa Aisha al-akhirah, Allahumma arham al-ansar wal-muhajara. There is no life but the hereafter. May Allah bless the Ansar and the Muhajir. So they would recite these lines, the Prophet would respond back to them. Imagine this harmony. Imagine this community building activity. And this is how the Prophet was able to make Medina a home for the Muslims after so many of them had lost their homes in Mecca. Another highlight and lesson to learn from our beloved Prophet.